Greetings and welcome to Patrick Henry College. I'm Graham Walker, president of the college, and it's my pleasure to welcome students, faculty, members of the public, and lots of other guests who are watching us via a live webcast to the beginning of this season's Newsmaker Interview Series hosted by Dr. Marvin Olasky. Dr. Olasky, as you know, is a well-respected and loved member of our faculty here at Patrick Henry College. He's also the editor-in-chief of World Magazine, and because of that connection, you will discover that most of these interviews are written up later and published in World Magazine. So in addition to the crowd of people here in person and on the web, there are some 400,000 plus readers of World Magazine who will eventually participate in our deliberations this week. It's great to have Marvin Olasky here. As you know, he's an extraordinary track record in the articulation of public policy and Christian philosophy for a lot of contemporary social problems. In addition to being the editor-in-chief of World Magazine, he was the author of the book Compassionate Conservatism and the Tragedy of Welfare Reform, another number of key works in social policy that have had a big influence on American public life. Today, he's interviewing Christina Hoff Sommers, and I am happy to welcome her as well. A few little details about our interviewee today. Dr. Sommers graduated Phi Beta Kappa from New York University and earned her PhD in philosophy from Brandeis. She was a philosophy professor at Clark University and is presently a resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute in Washington, D.C. She's also a member of the Board of Advisors for the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education. She's spoken at over 100 college campuses and served on the National Advisory Board of the Independent Women's Forum. Dr. Sommers is known for arguing that feminism in our day has narrowed needlessly to a narrow special interest group that leaves the majority of women behind. Her works also emphasize the Christian feminism of women like Hannah More and Frances Willard in an earlier generation. In an atmosphere that is increasingly a no-tolerance policy for even pretend violence or superhero imaginative games or rough play, there has arisen what she calls a criminalization of the young male imagination. The play that develops young boys' moral imagination is often squashed in favor of quieter, nicer, less competitive and more feelings-oriented education. Many of her articles present creative ways to re-engage the young male mind in education and make schools more what she calls boy-friendly. Her books include, among many, Who Stole Feminism?, another called The War Against Boys, another called One Nation Under Therapy, and another titled The Science on Women and Science. So please welcome Dr. Christina Hoff Sommers.
Well, thank you all for coming, and it's great to be back here on campus. President Walker's introductions were good and accurate in every respect of which I know, except that he left out one important detail about both Christina and me, namely that each of us has a granddaughter. And Christina's granddaughter, Eliza, and Susan and I have a 1-month-old grandbaby named Louisa. And I mention this now because Christina wrote last year about her granddaughter, about what happened when someone gave her a toy train, and the grandbaby placed it in a baby carriage and covered it with a blanket so it could get some sleep. Now, what does that tell you?
Well, boys and girls are different. There are exceptions. I'm talking about the rules. And as a rule, a little girl's choice of play, the earliest age, involves a lot of theatrical, imaginative games, turn-taking games. And as they get a little older, the most important thing of all is that best friend, exchanging confidences with a best friend. Boys tend not to do this. The theatrical, imaginative games, not so much. Exchanging confidences with a best friend, haven't seen it. What they do is, experts on playground dynamics call it rough and tumble play. And that means a lot of running around, mock fighting. There are usually sound effects, and the boys tend to be very happy. But many experts on childhood play are worried that as a society, we prefer the way girls play. And many parents and teachers have confused rough and tumble play with violence. Now, when children are violent, there's a lot of unhappiness. They part as enemy. Violent children are usually not popular. Just the opposite with rough and tumble play. The children are not crying, they're very happy. And a boy who is good at it will tend to be popular. They're building critical social skills. They're learning about limitations of, physical limitations. And as a society, if we clamp down on that and we don't allow it, not only do we threaten their social development, not only do we make them rather unhappy with school, but also there's pretty good evidence to show that this may be in part an explanation of why boys are so far behind in reading and writing, because play is the basis for learning. And if the earliest experience a little boy has is disapproval, in some cases little boys are suspended for their drawings or for playing cops and robbers or this kind of imaginative superhero play. So what I've argued is that we have to become more tolerant of the way boys are and accept, as I said in the beginning, that on average, boys and girls are different.
And you mentioned in that article the experience of Hasbro, the toy makers, when they hoped to market a playhouse with dolls and a toy baby carriage to both boys and girls. Tell us what the girls did with that as compared to what the boys did with that. Do you recall?
Yes. At the Hasbro laboratory in Providence, Rhode Island, they brought in children to interact with this playhouse, which they hoped to market to both boys and girls. Not because they were egalitarian feminists, but because if you can come up with a toy that will interest boys as much as girls, you double your profits. So this is something very much to be pursued for toy manufacturers. So they thought this playhouse, maybe all kids would play with it. Well, they did. The girls came in, played house, put the baby in the carriage, played with the toy stove and refrigerator. The boys came in, had this miniature baby carriage, got up onto the roof and catapulted it from the roof of the toy house. And then the Hasbro psychologist said, she had this novel explanation. She said, my goodness, they really are different. They are.
And if this were a doll, a girl would put it to bed and soothe it and so forth, and a boy would go,
right. And now my colleagues in feminist theory will say, well, we created that. It's a social construction. The parents influence them that way. There are researchers now who have studied vervet monkeys and found that the males, if given the choice, the males tend to go to the gadgets and the females tend to go to the sort of, nurture the little vervet monkey dolly, I guess the equivalent. So I'm sure that, of course, culture has an influence, but Mother Nature has something to say about basic difference. And what I find, I speak on a lot of campuses, and it is now an article of faith that we are all born to be, one feminist put it very dramatically. She said, we're all born bisexual and then transformed into male and female gendered human beings, one to command, the other to obey. And I told it to my husband. He said, which one commands and which obeys? But anyway, that's how it is seen in many gender studies programs.
So if there were an accurate understanding of these differences, what would that look like then? Let's say starting in kindergarten and then continuing up through K through 6. How would schools be different than they are now?
First of all, teachers would learn in teachers' colleges, something they're not learning today, that girls are readier for school. A 5-year-old girl is a more mature being than a 5-year-old boy. It is very hard for him to sit still. And what interests a little girl and what interests a little boy, somewhat different. And I think there was probably a time where teachers, I'm sure there was, where teachers kind of knew this, just intuitively, that you had to teach sort of in, stereophonically, and they're just different styles. And as I said in the beginning, there are kids that defy the stereotype. So you'll have little girls that are tomboys and boys that are more effeminate, and they would benefit from these two styles. But increasingly, there's just one style, is that we want classes that are sedentary, competition-free. Increasingly, our classrooms are risk-averse. And as they move in that direction, they move further and further away from the needs of little boys. So how would they look? They would allow lots of recess. There would be different if you go into a lot of classrooms, I once had the superintendent of schools of Bloomfield School District in Michigan call me and say, after I'd written The War Against Boys, and she said, all of our classrooms are very comfortable places for the girls. But most of the teachers are women, and there are, flowers, and there are snowflakes, and pretty, and I'm telling them, maybe you should put something boys like, and I'm thinking, yeah, maybe some, I don't know, dangerous insects or rockets, or and a lot of teachers are just uncomfortable with that. So a lot of young men go into a classroom just feeling as though they don't belong there.
Let's keep going on this. What difference would it be in high school?
Oh boy. Well, first of all, boys and girls, on average, find different sorts of books interesting. Now, if you go to an airport bookstore or shop, they don't say men's magazines and women's magazines, but we know they are there. It's the women's magazines. You'll typically see faces and all sorts of human interest and fashion, and the men's magazine is usually stuff. There'll be a race car, or there'll be, and I don't know what they put on Popular Mechanics. 90% of the people who subscribe to Popular Mechanics are males. So I would say in a high school classroom, those Popular Mechanics people, the kinds of books they read and what they like to do, there would be some accommodation. And what we should have in our high schools, for example, not everybody is going to go to college. And right now, far more girls than boys go to colleges. Our colleges are 57% female. 62% of the master's degrees last year and the year before went to females. Women have now surpassed men even in getting PhDs, now 52%. So the boys are far less likely to get education beyond high school. But to survive in the new economy, you need education beyond high school. So we should keep up with the Europeans, what they're offering in their high schools. It's career and technical training. And when I was writing the new edition of The War Against Boys, I visited Aviation High School in Queens, New York. These are more than 2,000 kids. And I went to this school. It was in this gritty part of Queens. I thought, this can't be a high school. It didn't look like a factory. And I went inside, and again, I thought I was in the wrong place because it was so quiet. 2,000 high school kids, and it's quiet. They were all in their classrooms, and these kids weren't merely interested. They were enthralled. They have half the day academics, but they have to do well. They have to get through these English classes and these history classes and French classes in order to spend the other half of the day tinkering with an airplane that's parked out in the parking lot or taking their courses in aviation. Now, the school is 87% male, and I met some girls that are there, and they're fabulous. They do, they know they're different. It's not a typical girl that is interested in aviation mechanics. But this high school is, and many of the kids come from struggling, urban communities. It's mostly Hispanic, Black, Asian kids. One of the highest graduation rates, college matriculation rates. They move on to fantastic careers. This should be a model for other parts of the country. It's not just me saying this. Harvard University Graduate School recently had a conference called Pathways to Prosperity. And they talked about how so many kids aren't achieving the American dream. It used to be, certainly maybe your parents or certainly your grandparents, they could go to high school, have a high school diploma, and then work hard in something that interested them and make it into the middle class. It's very hard to do that now without education beyond high school. And so this Pathways to Prosperity study brought together leaders, education leaders from all over the world, and what they agreed was that our high schools should be partly career training and that we should offer pathways into good jobs. And so there's a lot of technical training. And they're for girls and boys. The problem is the girls and boys don't tend to specialize in the same things, so you'll find a disproportionate number of girls in these programs. They have a good system in Massachusetts. It's called the Cadillac of career and technology education. They have great, that should be studied. That's what the Pathways to Prosperity study says. But the girls tend to go into early childhood education. Cosmetology is popular, as well as various medical professions. And it's the boys who are in welding and automotive repair, computer technology, disproportionately. So these women's groups in Washington are trying to impose Title IX, and they're going this equity law, and they consider it inequitable that as many girls aren't showing up for welding and refrigeration and trucking, and so. And I try to introduce a little common sense that, yes, introduce the girls to these fields because you will make more money if you're a metallurgist or an aviation mechanic than you will as an early childhood educator. So let the young women know that. But it isn't enough just to let them know that. They have essentially a quota system, and they risk losing funding if they don't get more kids to go. So long-winded answer, but I would like to see more of these programs, and I would take the gender politics out of it.
Okay, so our current educational system hurts individuals, and particularly guys here, educationally. What does it do socially? As people get into their 20s and early 30s and are thinking about marriage and so forth, what effect does that have on?
Yes, well, we have millions of young men, and it's across races. It's the white working class, the white poor. It's in the black community, the Hispanic community. We have millions of young men who are academically disaffected. They don't like school. Either they drop out of high school or they graduate, and then what do? And increasingly, they are not, as I said, they're not going on to pursue education beyond high school. They're going to have a terrible time succeeding in this economy. More than that, they are going to have a hard time getting married because women tend to want to marry someone who has some prospects and who can help raise a family. So we're not going to have this terrible hardship for these young men who have bleak prospects, but young women who are getting the education, because what I'm telling you is across the all the sort of the race and ethnicities, what you find is the young women are doing much better than their male counterparts. But typically people want to marry someone with similar education. The boys, the marriageable young men are not going to be there. So, and we have a kind of vicious cycle because you're going to have more and more women, as we see, having children out of wedlock because the men are not marriageable or the men won't marry them. It's a social crisis as well as an educational and economic crisis.
Most of the students at Patrick Henry are from homeschooling backgrounds. And so let me just ask about that. For parents who are aware of the differences, as parents do become aware, and haven't been sufficiently ideologized that they ignore the differences, what difference would that make in terms of the homeschool curricula that people should be adopting?
Well, fortunately, the British and the Australians and the Canadians, they're facing the same problem with their young men, but they have a different political climate, and they're allowed to admit that there are differences. So we can look to their example, and they have developed curricula. They've developed reading lists of books for various ages that little boys find irresistible. And so you would want to find these books, and you would also just understand that, again, talking about the typical child, sitting for a long period of time, that can work for, I mean, it's not great for girls, but girls can put up with more, apparently. And with boys, more active learning, and other things. Talking about personal problems, I read a wonderful study a few days ago about why don't boys want to talk about feelings. And there's feminist theorists who say, oh, it's because of a toxic masculinity. Men are shut down, repressed. They're afraid that if they talk about their feelings, they'll be humiliated. So these scholars, I think it was the University of Pennsylvania, they interviewed a large sample of young men and asked them, why don't you talk about your feelings and your problems? And they asked girls as well. What they found was that girls felt much better after talking about their problems. The boys didn't. The boys, the number one answers they got from the boys was, sitting around talking about your problems was weird and a waste of time. And then it wasn't because they were humiliated or they thought they'd be ashamed. They just didn't find it practical or interesting. So one of the things these researchers advised and other experts have said, if your son or your little brother, some boy, or even your husband, you want to talk, first of all, it has to be, it's not just for the sake of sharing feelings. Do that with your girlfriends or your mom, but typically a man won't see the point of it unless there's something to be solved. And there is a very robust finding from this study. So I think if you want a boy to be interested in a book, he's not automatically going to find it fascinating to read books about, I don't know, women and their self-esteem issues. And there are a lot of books like that. My son was assigned several in high school. You might want to look for adventure stories and also books, nonfiction. The British found that boys like nonfiction and little boys like comic books, and they're more likely, not so much poetry, not so much. That has to be cultivated. That is a social construction for a male anyway, to admire and enjoy poetry. So just to know that it's going to be easier to get your daughter to read. She's probably more verbal. She probably started talking earlier. Now, Mother Nature is fair because males have an advantage with spatial reasoning. Girls have better verbal skills, typically. Boys better visual, this capacity to rotate a three-dimensional object in his brain. Boys are better at finding their way out of a maze. Girls are better at remembering everything they saw along the way. So, so just to know this and use it as a basis for learning and the way he wants to play. Watch the child. And you may have a bookish boy who's just quiet and automatically loves poetry and things, but chances are you will not. He's feels like a caged animal and he wants to get out. So be aware of that and work with it.
So the war on boys is one of the negative effects of feminism. And feminism generally does not have positive connotations in Christian or conservative circles for the most part. But you've written about some feminists, of which these folks should know. Tell us about Hannah More.
I'll tell you about Hannah More in 1 second,
okay,
because I'll just qualify this indictment of feminism. Maybe I should have called it like the women's movement. I think that's been so positive. We've all benefited. We're in the new millennium, and women have been emancipated. Women can do anything they want to in terms of pursuing their interests, and I think that was a great achievement of the women's movement. We had two major waves of feminism, the first wave earning the vote, the second wave breaking down barriers in the workplace and addressing issues like sexual harassment and so forth. But it became very narrow. And now if you ask women, are you a feminist? Almost all of them say no. It's hard to get more than 20, or sometimes with young women, maybe 25% will say they are. 75 to 80% say no. And men, it's 15, 16% will identify. Most people reject the label. Even women, they asked Taylor Swift, she said she wasn't a feminist. Beyonce says she wasn't. Marissa Mayer, the CEO of Yahoo, said, oh no, I'm not a feminist. Sandra Day O'Connor. How can it be that these successful, and effective women of the contemporary women reject it? And I think the movement has simply become so kind of elite and very, very left-wing, and with a lot of kind of eccentric views about the world, very male-averse. Some said you could reduce contemporary feminism to a phrase, women are from Venus, men are from hell. And most women don't think men are from hell. We're rather fond of you, so. So you're not going to have a lot of recruits. So what I did in this little book, Freedom Feminism, is that I went back and found that there are these wonderful precedents in this 18th century and the 19th century where there was a women's movement that united conservative and more liberal women and radical women in causes of common concern to women. So in the 18th century, you had Hannah More, who was an extraordinary woman and the peer of the most esteemed men of her age, Samuel Johnson and Edmund Burke. I mean, she had an incredible circle of people. But she became an evangelical Christian, part of the Clapham sect. She was friends with William Wilberforce. And just as he was a key figure in the abolition movement and in this miraculous coterie of genius and humanitarianism, with these evangelicals, she started a movement for women's education. She had a phrase, she believed in a kind of domestic heroines. She thought there should be, and she was addressing both aristocratic women, middle-class women, and poor women. She wanted education, and she believed men and women were different, and that women were the sort of nurturers of the nation, the caretakers of the nation. But she thought we can't keep them in the home; they have to be in the society, doing good works. And she promoted a new image of women, as I said, in all classes, that they must be engaged in good works, in philanthropic pursuits. And people listened. Hannah More was more famous than Jane Austen in the time, and she was famous throughout the world She's been forgotten because she was conservative. She believed in the free market, and she didn't like the French Revolution. She wrote against it. She may even some credit her with saving England from having that kind of upheaval in England. That was Hannah More. Now there was Mary Wollstonecraft, who was a more radical, and people have heard of her, and I like her too, and we needed both. But they got together. I mean, they didn't cooperate. They probably didn't really like each other. But their movements converged, and you had a kind of women's movement towards women's education and sort of empowered femininity. And it was when you had these two pillars, conservative and the more radical Mary Wollstonecraft. Moved to the 19th century, the suffrage movement. You've probably heard of Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, and they were more like Mary Wollstonecraft. They were trying to bring the European Enlightenment to American women. And American women met that with a combination of either indifference and sometimes hostility. They weren't succeeding. They needed new ideas. They kept being defeated. And women were organizing against the vote. How often have people organized against their own empowerment? It was very strange. They needed help, and they got it in the form of Frances Willard. And Frances Willard was the president of the Christian Temperance Union. Today we associate temperance with, I don't know, Carrie Nation and her axe, kicking down saloons. But under Frances Willard, it became sort of like the Clapham sect. It became a humanitarian movement, and they were doing all sorts of good works in orphanages and schools, and yes, temperance, because all feminists in that era were supported prohibition of alcohol, because the saloon was seen as the enemy of the home, because men would get drunk and spend all the family money or come home and be violent and so forth. So, but anyway, Frances Willard told women that they needed the vote, and she sort of rebranded the suffrage movement, and she called the vote the family protection ballot. And she told women, the homes you dearly love, you have to protect them, you need the vote. So she turned a kind of progressive, radical cause into a kind of conservative pursuit. So these two pillars, again, came together, and it worked. So I look to today, what do we have? Where is our women's movement? Because we still have problems. Well, first of all, we have many women in the developing world who are organizing for their liberation throughout Asia and Africa, and certainly in the Middle East. And I've been to international women's conferences, and I will meet the sort of the Susan B. Anthony of coming from the Ivory Coast or Somalia. They're trying desperately, and they come to these conferences to make common cause with American women, and there are typically very few American women there. And I think that's something so important, that if we had a healthy women's movement with conservative and libertarian women, there would be that sisterhood, that affinity with women struggling throughout the world. The second thing is we have a very misogynistic popular culture. It's not very nice to men either, but that's another story. And I think conservative and liberal women could agree on that. So I think there are things that we could do if we had a women's movement. Now, you could call it feminism, or maybe we need a new term, because perhaps that term has just become too burdened with these ideas of being angry at men and radical and so forth. But what I've called for is a rehabilitation, or a kind of a overhaul of the women's movement, and that conservative women should be at the helm.
You've used expressions freedom feminism, maternal feminism.
Yes.
What do you think? What, if you wanted to try to attach a label to the type of feminism
Yes.
you'd like, what would you use?
Well, when I look at these two traditions, maternal feminism, which really thought men and women were different, we had different roles, and so people like Hannah More and Frances Willard argued for an empowered femininity. Whereas Wollstonecraft, Cady Stanton especially, they saw men and women as mostly the same and essentially the same, and wanted to liberate women from their roles. What I've come up with is a kind of, I try to take what's best from both. So, and I call it freedom feminism, because I acknowledge that all men and women, not all women are the same. So there are going to be some women who are more like men. About 20% of women, the best data that I've seen, about 20% of women in the United States and Europe are as career-oriented as any man and not family-centered. So for those 20%, you know, I want a fair workplace. If they want to be CEOs or they want to be running labs and full professors and all that, I am enough of an egalitarian to want that opportunity. So I take that from Mary Wollstonecraft. I take that from Susan B. Anthony and the first and second wave movements in this country. However, here's where I think they go wrong, the contemporary feminists. There was truth in what Hannah More said. There was truth in what Frances Willard said. Most women do not want to be men. Even given all of our rights, all of our freedoms, every opportunity to play with trains instead of dolls, we'll turn the trains into dolls. We'll turn, you know, the boys will turn the baby carriage into and catapult it into whatever it was, a weapon or something. So most of us do embody. There's some truth about the stereotypes about men and women. And so what I think freedom feminism represents is I take that truth from maternal feminists, that yes, most of us do tend to have maternal instinct. When you have a child, you will find typically you are so madly in love, and your husband is too, but the obsession tends to be more with the woman. It's much more painful to be separated, like 40 or 50 hours a week to be away from your baby is very hard. Men and women, how often do women abandon their children? Almost never, unless there's mental illness or drug abuse or alcoholism. It just doesn't happen. How often do men abandon children? It's common. There is a difference. And so I think there was truth in maternal feminism. If you look at what women study in college, even today, after people trying to get us to be metallurgists and electrical engineers and petroleum, you know, I don't know, work on oil, women aren't doing it. They're still far more likely to go into education. There are fields where we've all but taken over. Veterinary medicine, women love that. It used to be a male field. We didn't need mentors. We didn't need women. Just as soon as the doors opened, we went in and took over. Same thing is happening with the social sciences. Women love it, taking over. Journalism, no problem. But there are other fields, electrical engineering, as other things I've mentioned, there just are these differences. So as a freedom feminist, what I say is that open the doors. I agree with Mary Wollstonecraft and, you know, equality of opportunity, but as a sympathy with maternal feminism, don't expect men and women to make the same choices. And you can have a successful, flourishing society where there is difference. Not every difference between men and women is indicative of injustice. It could be indicative of just the pursuit of happiness.
Yeah, one more question for me, and then we'll go to the floor for your questions. Students first. You're referring to Frances Willard, Hannah More, others, but this isn't just a Christian or conservative thing, because you also refer to Eleanor Roosevelt as a maternal feminist. If you could just talk about that for a moment, and then we'll go to your questions.
Yes, after women won the vote, that was the first wave of feminism, then the women's movement was sort of diminished, but it never went away, and you had a rise of maternal feminism in the United States, and it was tied up with the labor movement, and there were lots of efforts at protective legislation for women in the workplace, like that pregnant women wouldn't have to lift heavy things, and special provisions for mothers. So that was very much alive, and Eleanor Roosevelt was a part of that, and she did think the sexes were different. The key thing, by the way, about freedom feminism is that it doesn't see one as better. It doesn't see superior or inferiority. We got that from the egalitarians. We're not going back there. But it's sort of different but equal. And I think that's very much what Eleanor Roosevelt believed. And you know what? If they took a poll, I think that's what probably most people believe in the United States. I think it's a mainstream. I think that's what won. Freedom feminism is what I think most women are. Because you say, are you a feminist? And a lot of women will say, no, but I believe in. And what they're really saying is, no, I'm not angry at men. No, I'm not like calling for government programs for, every possible problem that comes along. I'm not necessarily left-wing, but I want my rights, and I want other women to have opportunities. And I think I call that freedom feminism. So I think it's the default feminism of most Americans, men too.
Okay, questions from you all. We have microphones which will be passed to whoever raises hand. One on either side. Raise hands. There's one down here. One in front over here or back over there.
Now, studies show, oh good, a woman, because studies show men are more likely to raise their hands, so.
There you go. My question is about the divide between what most people think of as the traditional feminists, who are usually very leftist, and the rest of us who, I love that freedom feminism that you talk about. How do you bridge that divide? They have the microphone and they have the media and it's the war on women stuff, and I have friends who we agree on a lot of things. You know, Afghan women are completely repressed. What can we do about this? But then, boy, does she hate American men. I can't cross that bridge with her. So how do you bring those two sides together that have some common interests?
That's, in my book, I was calling for a more ecumenical movement to bring more women to the table to solve huge problems. I'm not sure how to do it, except to call for it. I was just at Wellesley College, where it's very feminist, and it's sort of it's just in the air. But I said these same things, I mean, what I'm talking about with you, and I felt there was, certainly they were civil, and I think many agreed with me. So I think more people have to speak out, and I think more people have to start, it just has to enter the conversation, because here's what happens now. We have these women's organizations, and a lot of them were necessary in 1971, but it's a new world now, and they're still fighting battles. They're knocking down doors that are already open. They don't take yes for an answer. They seem to, the better things get for women, the angrier they seem to become. It's odd. So I think that we have this women's lobby, and it's very well entrenched, very politically connected, and they're well organized. There's something called the National Council for Research on Women. It's like 120 research organizations that work night and day to promote fairly hardline feminism. And they have lawyers and scholars. It's elaborate. This has to be challenged. This is very important, because we need a counterpoise. We need some balance. We need other voices. Because when the media, when they need a story, even conservatives, even in Congress, if they need data on women, they will call up one of these organizations, because that's kind of the women's brain trust that coming out of like these the Wellesley Center for Research on Women. Many campuses have these centers, and they tend to be pretty hardline feminist in ideology. So one of the practical things I suggest, it's going to take a while, but you could have a small group to start, is we need different centers to study gender and to study men and women. It shouldn't be coming from this like-minded small, it's not small, but in terms of depth of philosophy and breadth, it's very narrow. So we need more voices. So I really encourage you, and especially those of you who are thinking to go to graduate school, one of the big problems when you go to get a PhD is, what do I write about? Because you get these very narrow topics. There is so much to be written. Everything is to be written about gender, about men and women, because what happened is we overthrew the patriarchy. Women would say, oh, only men were writing on women's psychology or human psychology. It's all just the study of men. So they replaced it with just the study of radical feminists. So it hasn't been written. We don't have even this Finding Hannah More. I had to go to these fantastic scholars, mostly at UCLA, and they're feminists and everything, but they're more scholars than they are feminists, and they discovered her, and they're very excited about her. And these were women's studies historians who found her, and I almost feel like there's like a lost continent of conservative feminism. And these conservative heroines that have been lost, they're there to be discovered. So if you have to find a graduate department that'll put up with you doing that, but lots of work to be done. So I'm sorry, it's not going to be easy, because it took them about 30 or 40 years to build up this little empire. We need a counter empire. We need, not even empire, I don't want to use that language, we just need different sources for information. And a lot of it, I'm sorry to say this, but a lot of the statistics that come from the women's groups, can't be trusted because they seem to be completely amenable to any study that shows that American women are victims. If they can show that, you know, most of us are being cheated out of our incomes, discriminated against, harassed, battered by our husbands, and they exaggerate. And they're very welcoming to studies that show high levels of victimization. But I have found in my research very reputable studies, actually many of them coming from the Bureau of Justice or the National Center for Education Statistics, that's where I did most of my research on boys, was very good data from the Department of Education. But they don't disseminate that data. They find their own advocacy research. And I believe that if you want to help women who are victimized by violence, first thing you need is good research. These women are not going to be helped by bogus studies, hyperbole, fake statistics. Women are going to be helped by truth. And then we build up policies around that core of truth. And unfortunately, I don't think the women's lobby today is providing it. So both for getting the good data as well as better theories, and most importantly, sort of mending this breach between men and women. I think that this idea that we're adversaries, or many women go around sort of resenting men. They enter marriages thinking that, you know, okay, it's going to be 50%, and they keep track, and then they end up fighting all the time. And I think someone should warn them that, on average, your husband is not going to be as concerned with, you know, the details of domesticity as you are. You might be lucky, or you might be different, you marry a different kind of person, but on average, women care more about taking care of their homes. And so you have to understand that, and in what I said before about talking about problems all the time, you have to understand, and so that's why I think it's also important to have psychologists and others who aren't operating from a victim feminist perspective to tell us how to get along with each other. But as I said, the magazines, even legislators, they get their information from these women's groups, and we need to open it up. We need more voices. We need intellectual diversity.
Let's see, down here.
I really appreciated and found fascinating what you were talking about in regards to child psychology and the difference between young boys and girls at different developmental stages. I wondered if you might point to scholarship in that area that you consider to be accurate and helpful to understanding this dynamic, and also what kinds of scholarship you think would be necessary and useful in this area going forward.
Yes, well, what has helped me enormously in everything that I do is, in the books that I've written, I'll look at something like play preferences, male-female differences, how children, boys and girls, baby boys and baby girls, and I always find the scholars. And there are lots of scholars who are not political in the least, and they do not wish to be. The last thing they want is to get into some argument. You have to have a certain temperament to be willing to go out and argue with people, and a lot of scholars aren't like that. But the research is there. And just to begin, there's David Gary, G-E-A-R-Y, the University of Missouri, has a book on male-female differences. And it's a compendium of all the studies in all the domains, and he looks at evolutionary psychology, and he looks at studies in biology and studies in neuroscience. And he probably has 300 footnotes to the research. So it's there. The research is there. There's more to be done. But that's somehow not the research that gets into the media echo chamber. Because, as I said, it goes through these women's centers, and they edit it out. They only want studies that show that we're all the same. So I would look there. And just, if you go to, there was a book on human nature that Steve Pinker wrote, and he challenged this idea that the sexes are the same. And he did it, again, just very scientifically. And so it's what I prefer. I don't like to go, there are some popularizers, men are from Mars, women are from Venus or something, and those are fun, but I like to go to the scholarship. And if you start with Gary, or you started with Pinker, or Steve Rhodes at University of Virginia has written a great book on male-female differences, and it's all tied to the scholarship. It's there, and it's all footnoted in The War Against Boys. So.
On the question of scholarship, you've taken a lot of flack for your falling afoul of the feminist lobby. And I was looking at the section in the War Against Boys on research, and as you say, a lot of other scholars also have gotten in a lot of trouble when they try to confront the feminist lobby. And this is becoming a pattern. You're probably aware that there are many scholars like Daphne Patai, her book on
Yes.
sexual harassment. But I'm finding this a pattern even broader than that. A number of scholars recently, you met Jay Belsky at Penn State University, took on the daycare lobby. And he was, again, he was driven out of Penn State. He ended up at the University of London. There's a fascinating new book that just came out on the AIDS establishment by Edward Green, a Harvard anthropologist, epidemiologist, who's confronted the AIDS lobby. I get the impression these scholars don't know about one another when they have, and yet the patterns they come up with are remarkably similar. The critique that they come up with of the patterns and the methods of the feminist lobby are strikingly similar, and the way they are treated, then the ostracism, the blacklisting, the driven sometimes out of the universities, is also remarkably similar. Is there some way we could create kind of a union of
dissidents,
dissident scholars?
Yes.
Yeah.
What you say is true. It can be career diminishing to study sex differences and come out with the wrong thing. If you study sex differences and show that women are better, that's fine. There's a psychologist that calls the women are wonderful phenomenon, the WA phenomenon. But if you ever show that men have any advantage, that's discrimination. It has to be fought. So to find a way around that and not to invite opprobrium and so forth is tricky, because there are these groups that consider it backlash. And again, it depends on your temperament. If you want to organize, there is a group called the National Association of Scholars, which tries to bring together dissident scholars in various areas who are odd man out. But in our universities, there's very little intellectual diversity. And I will say, when at Wellesley, I had a lovely time, but it was clear to me that many of the things I was saying, they sort of sat there like, can she be saying these things? And what I was saying was common sense. I mean, it doesn't merely have a foundation in research. I mean, some of it is controversial, but a lot of it is just common sense. Or a lot of it is just check the record and look at the data at the Department of Justice or the Department of Education. It's not opinion, it's established in the empirical literature. So we have to, I don't know about a union of scholars. However, I do think, here's what I'm noticing with the younger scholars coming at AEI. I have a friend at AEI called Mark Perry, who's an economist, University of Michigan. He has a great website you might want to go. It's at the AEI website, but he's embedded there and separate, I guess, too, called Carpe Diem. And it's Mark Perry. And if it can be charted and grafted, you need Mark, because he can chart, and he's a little younger than I am and a different generation, so he's not afraid. He doesn't know he's supposed to be afraid. And so he's taken on the feminist lobby and in imaginative, wonderful ways, and it's all tough-minded and empirical and funny. And so my hope is that I'm beginning to see, it started with the economists. They've challenged that this wage gap, you always hear women only earn 77 cents and we're being discriminated against. It is true that if you take all the women in America and all the men and you average who work full-time and you average the income, there will be roughly a 23-cent gap, a 24-cent gap, depending on how you calculate it. And so immediately the women's groups say, you see discrimination. Well, the economists, and including a few feminist economists, they will look and say, well, maybe the two groups aren't exactly the same. You have to do some controls. Like, where do they work? And how many hours a week do they work? This is all the women in America who work full-time. Some of them may have withdrawn from the workplace for 15 years to raise a family, and then they went back. Is it fair to compare her income to the guy sitting next to her who was in the office 9 to 5 for those 15 years when she was at home? Is that fair? It doesn't make any sense. No, you need to do the proper controls. You need to ask, what did they major in college? And as I told you, most girls, not most, but a majority, tend to major in the less well-paying fields. Right now, I can tell you, if you want to be wealthy and you want to close the wage gap, all the young women in this audience, immediately change your major to petroleum engineering. Forbes magazine, you'll earn $100,000 a couple of years out of college. So, but then would you really want to do that, you know? So most of us, I mean, I would not have, somebody brought me a petroleum engineering textbook and I wanted to study philosophy. I would look at it and it would just look so boring to me compared to reading Plato and Aristotle. Although I realize not everyone wants to read Plato and Aristotle, but I liked it. Anyway, the point is that you have to do these controls. What did the woman study? What did the man study? What fields did they go in? And how many hours a week do they work? Because men work more hours per week. And then the women's groups will come back to me and say, no, even in the same fields, we looked at doctors and we looked at pharmacists. That's the same field. And the people who work full-time, the men are earning more. You have to ask a question. A doctor, there are subspecialties. What kind of doctor is she or he? Now, it turns out the highest paying fields in medicine, some of them, are anesthesiology and cardiac surgery, mostly men. What do you think the women have taken over? Pediatrics and family medicine. Again, that caring, nurturing, there's Hannah Moore is waiting to us. Women do that. They find it meaningful and interesting. And so that's why I say freedom feminism, the freedom to pursue what you want. And so with this statistic, when you do these controls, it narrows to the point of vanishing. So, oh my goodness, what was the question? I've gone far afield, but that was the answer to a question, but I forget the question.
Next question.
Can you give us some examples of legislation that has been passed in Congress that was influenced by the radical feminist movement? And also, what do you think about the Act to Prevent Violence Against Women? And was that influenced by the radical feminist movement? Thank you.
Yes. Well, we passed in, I think it was 94, the Gender Equity in Education Act, and that was about the time I was working on the war against boys. That act classified girls as underserved population on a par with different minorities or just anybody that you could say had been underserved. They put girls in there, and there were hundreds of millions of dollars available for programs for girls. Now, actually, some of these programs were good because girls do need extra help in math and science and strengthening them and in making it interesting to them. But that was problematic because if you look at about 1994 was the year the girls, well, it was a little before, started to move ahead, not only in college enrollments. I mean, extraordinary things are happening. Girls are getting better grades. Even among the superstars, you know, the top 5%, the girls are more ambitious and today than they were 20 years ago and have higher aspirations. So we passed that act. That act was completely the creation of the women's lobby. It was all, I don't know that it was written, but I think it was probably written by the American Association of University Women. So there was an example. And it's fine to have programs for girls and to have gender awareness, but what happened to the boys? They were left behind, and we're paying the price now. So that's another example. The Violence Against Women Act. What it should have been, I think, is the Violence in Families Act, because, first of all, it's a complicated, horrendous problem. There are many different kinds. They take something like domestic violence. The police will tell you and it is connected to poverty and drug abuse and alcohol. I mean, it'll happen in families that don't have those problems, but it's quite rare. But in terms of families that have a lot of dysfunction, and one of the most vulnerable settings for violence and child abuse is a mother's, who has different boyfriends, live-in boyfriends, and these kinds of chaotic households. The women's groups won't organize around that. I mean, if you want to stop family violence and a lot of abuse, you probably want a Family Stabilization Act. You probably want Get the Fathers Back in the Home Act. A lot of those things would diminish the violence. The other thing is that, and the women's groups, some of them will agree to this and admit this, but as I said, there are different kinds of of violence. There are what the police call the Saturday night brawlers. They go to the same houses every week, a drunken couple going at each other. Then you will have the sociopathic killer, O.J. or Mark Peterson or whatever, these dangerous guys. Very rare, but they're there. And then there's a lot of, in young couples, they will do surveys and say, have you ever grabbed or slammed a door? And they ask, and a lot of people will say, yeah, I've been grabbed or I've slammed doors, and they count that as violence. And so then they'll come out and they won't report that the men have had women grab them or slap, and the men get slapped a lot more. So if they include the male answers, then it looks like there's an epidemic of violence against men. But they just report the women, and then they enlarge it, and then it looks like 50% of American women have been battered. And I even saw Ahmadinejad from Iran was citing statistics about how horrible life is in the West, and he was telling how many women are being beaten up, as if it's bad here compared to Iran. But he was using these advocacy statistics. So what I wish is that the Violence Against in Families Act was more humane, was more honest about what's going on, scientific, because when a woman is really in danger, and being stalked and so forth, we've come up with they have some brilliant ways to analyze women who are at grave risk, and not include the other problem with people just being unpleasant and screaming and slamming doors and all of that. That's I don't know. We need public service announcements about being polite or civil, but it's a different order of problem. But violence in the family, and then it should have included children, because children are where is anything equivalent for children who are victims of neglect and abuse? And often it's the mother, so it's not a fashionable topic for feminists. Now, it's not because mothers are more cruel, but mothers are with the kids more, so there are more opportunities to be freaked out and act out, and the neglect of children. So I wish that it had been more, as I said, inclusive and centered on what we know is one important solution, is stabilizing the family, because the father with his own children, with his own wife, that's the safest environment. Whereas you open it up and you have moms live-in boyfriends and so forth, then it goes up exponentially, the violence and the child abuse.
Well, it's 1:40, so we're going to have to conclude shortly. I want to offer a real quick preview of a couple of coming attractions. Tomorrow at 12:20, we'll have here Stephen James, a novelist, author of some very popular and good murder mysteries. There's a lot of violence. There's a lot of ugly stuff he writes about in his novels, and he'll talk about that a little bit in his criticism of Christian fiction as often being too nice, and thus not really biblical. That's tomorrow at 12:20, and then Wednesday at 12:40. This is the Newsmaker series, and we'll have a person who's been very much in the news this month. This is a late edition. It wasn't on the earlier schedule, but we'll have Craig James here at 12:40 on Wednesday. Craig James is a former football star, ESPN analyst. You may have read about him this month because he ran for the Senate in Texas last year and lost, but in the course of doing so, he expressed his opposition to homosexuality. This month, he was hired by Fox Sports as a football analyst. He had done that on ESPN. And then the next day, as they looked at some statements he had made concerning homosexuality in the Republican primary debates, he was fired. And he is now suing Fox Sports on a question of religious liberty, because he says, and we'll learn more about this on Wednesday, that here are his beliefs, and he's being fired by Fox, not for anything he said on the air, not for anything connected with his job, but because before being hired, he made statements, not ugly statements, but factual statements concerning homosexuality that are now reason, apparently, why he cannot be a football analyst on Fox Sports. So this is likely to be a big religious liberty case, and he'll be here on Wednesday at 12:40 to talk about it. So Stephen James tomorrow, Craig James, no relation, on Wednesday, and I hope to see you there. Right now, please join me in thanking Dr. Sommers for coming.